She was sold like cattle, but the son of the man who traded her returned with more than guilt. He came back with fire and the will to make it right. Before we dive in, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and hit the subscribe button. The train hissed and sighed like something dying as it slowed through the dust-choked edge of Pine Hollow, a town so small the station didn't even have a name carved into its sign. Josephine clutched her little carpet bag to her chest. The one with the satin lining her mother had sewn into it with prayers and rose-scented thread, and stepped down from the last car with a careful smile practiced for months. She wore her best blue dress, the one she'd mended 3 times, and a bonnet she hoped said, "Kind wife," instead of desperate. She was 23 and had never been kissed, not properly, and now she was about to meet her husband-man. She'd only known through ink and soft-spoken promises, but no one called her name. No one held a sign or wore a nervous grin. Instead, there was a man with a hard jaw and tobacco-stained fingers leaning against a rail post. His boots were cracked, his eyes sharp, and when he saw her, he didn't tip his hat or offer a hand. He just jerked his thumb toward a wagon and said, "You're her, then?" Her smile faltered. "I'm Josephine Hart. I was to marry." Yeah, marry," he grunted, already grabbing her bag. "Come on, long ride ahead." She stood still. "Where's Mr. Alton? Where's my fiancé?" The man chuckled, low and bitter. "My son's busy. He don't need a wife no more. But I paid good money for you. 2 horses and a barrel of salt." Josephine froze. That's not how this works." The man climbed up onto the wagon bench. "You comin', or do I leave you here for the coyotes?" Her throat tightened. The station agent had already walked away. The train was huffing back down the track like it couldn't get out fast enough. Her choices dried up like water in the July sun. So she climbed onto the wagon with shaking hands and swallowed every scream that tried to crawl up her throat. The man didn't speak for hours. He chewed and spat and drove like the reins were his bones. The landscape grew cruelorox like teeth, trees twisted by wind. When they reached the cabin, it was almost dark. No lights, no welcome, just a shack and a corral with a sway-backed mule. He dragged her inside, dropped her bag on the dirt floor and said, "There's your bed." It was a pile of hay and a blanket. She stood, unmoving. He stepped closer, breath sour, voice low. "You think you're too good? You were bought, girl. Just like them horses." The slap came quick, her cheek flaring hot, and when she hit the ground, she didn't cry. She just pressed her fingers into the soil like maybe it could swallow her whole. The days blurred. Chores, commands, silence. He didn't touch her the way she feared, not yet, but the threat hung like smoke in every shadow. She tried to run once. He caught her before she reached the river, tied her wrists till they bled, and left her in the barn overnight with only rats for company. After that, she stopped trying. Her name felt foreign in her own mouth. Her voice shrank. She existed like a ghost, tethered to a man who didn't want a wife, only property. On the 6th night, as stars blinked cold above the roof, she heard hooves. She peeked through the slats and saw a rider, younger, lean, with the same sharp jaw but kinder eyes. He rode up slow, dismounted, looked toward the cabin. She held her breath. He knocked once, twice. The door opened. Voices low, tense, then a shout, then silence. The younger man turned, looked toward the barn for the briefest second. Their eyes met. Something in his face cracked open. Then he turned, mounted, and rode off into the dark. She thought she imagined it. Thought maybe hope had finally made her mad. But the next day, the trader paced like a man being hunted. Drank more. Didn't hit her, but looked at her like she was a problem. That night, she whispered into the straw, "If you're real, come back. Please come back." She didn't expect an answer. The West didn't care for women like her. Bought, broken, buried under shame. But somewhere far off, a rifle was being loaded, a saddle cinched tight. And a son who'd never made a promise was preparing to break every rule his father ever lived by. The morning air was thick with the smell of sweat and leather, as Josephine bent over the wash basin, scrubbing until her knuckles ached and her fingernails split from the cold water and lye soap. The scent of her own skin, slowly erased by the sting of a life she hadn't chosen. Behind her, the trader snored in his chair, half drunk, boots still on, a rifle leaned lazily beside him, like a threat he no longer needed to voice. She moved quietly, always quietly, because silence was the only thing that kept her from the back of his hand, or the cruel twist of his mouth when he told her what she was worth. But something in the wind had changed, even if she couldn't name it. There'd been that rider. That Boyman, really with a face too familiar and too different all at once, like he belonged to another world and yet had her name stitched behind his eyes. She hadn't imagined him. The look they shared through the barn slats had branded itself behind her ribs. She knew it as surely as she knew how many steps from the shack to the well, how many hours she had to wait before the trader would get too drunk to notice her crying into the floorboards. And that look hadn't been pity, it had been rage, the kind that doesn't go away, the kind that means something's coming. She didn't dare hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, a liar with a sweet voice and a sharp knife. But even as she told herself not to believe, she found her hands smoothing her hair more carefully that morning, her torn dress tugged straighter, her mouth practicing her name in a whisper, as if someone might say it kindly again. Just after noon, the trader stumbled outside to check the mule and curse the sun, spitting tobacco into the wind like it owed him money. Josephine stood in the doorway, watching him with eyes dulled by survival, until she saw it dust, rising on the horizon, curling like smoke. A rider, coming fast. The trader didn't see it at first. He was too busy cursing the bent wagon wheel and kicking the fence post like it might apologize. But Josephine saw, and her heart clenched. The shape was lean, straight-backed, purposeful. Not the slouch of a drifter or the lurch of a drunk. It was him. She knew it before she could breathe. "Someone's coming," she said quietly. The trader turned, squinting into the distance. His hand went to his belt. The boy rode closer, and Josephine saw the rifle across his back, the worn coat, the eyes sharp as wind off the ridge. He didn't slow. The trader stiffened. "Ethan?" he called out, a half-laugh in his voice. "That you, boy?" Ethan didn't answer. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots landing in dust. "Where is she?" he asked, voice cold as the blade Josephine once hid in her skirt hem before he found it and threw it in the fire. The trader spread his arms. "She's here just fine. Just needed a place. You took too long writing back. Had to make a deal. You traded her." Ethan's voice didn't rise. It sank, deeper, like thunder before a storm. "2 horses and salt," the old man said, shrugging. "Better than what she was worth in St. Louis." Ethan moved like a shadow, hand brushing his rifle but not drawing it. "She's not property." "She ain't yours neither," the trader said. "You never paid for her, never married her. She's just a girl who needed feeding." "She's my fiancée," Ethan said, and this time the word landed like a bell tolling for the dead. "Your letter said you didn't want her," the trader barked. "Said you'd changed your mind." "I wrote to delay the wedding, not cancel it," Ethan snapped. "I was injured, and you took that as a chance to do what you always do, deal in flesh and lies." Josephine hadn't moved. She was frozen in the doorway, breath caught between fear and disbelief. The man who stood between her and the trader looked like someone who'd walked through fire and carried every ash in his bones. "I'm taking her," Ethan said. "You can come after me if you want, but you'll lose more than horses this time." The trader reached for the rifle by the porch. In a blur, Ethan had his leveled. "Don't," he warned. "Not unless you want to dig your own grave before dinner." The 2 men locked eyes, time stretching like a wire pulled taut. Then the trader's hand dropped. Ethan turned to Josephine, and his voice softened. "You ready to leave?" She nodded, lips trembling. He reached out a hand, slow, open, not demanding. She stepped forward, past the man who'd broken her down, toward the boy who'd come back. As her fingers touched his, the trader barked from behind. "You walk off now, girl. Don't you ever think you can come back." She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. She climbed onto the horse behind Ethan, arms around his waist, heart beating like a drum buried under dust. As they rode away, she whispered, "You really came back." And he said, low but certain, "I never should have let you go." The stars above them were cold and watchful as the fire crackled between two pine stumps, casting long shadows that danced across Josephine's tired face, her eyes flickering with a kind of disbelief that had no words yet, only silence. She sat wrapped in a threadbare blanket Ethan had pulled from his saddle roll, the smell of horsehair and pine resin still clinging to it, and across from her, he carved a piece of jerky with his hunting knife, not looking at her too directly but never quite turning away either. The night pressed in close, not with threat but with the sheer weight of all that hadn't been said, the gap between who they'd been and who they were now. She watched him, trying to find pieces of the boy who had written her letters so carefully, the ones where his words were nervous but hopeful, always ending with a line about dream small ones, like chickens and a porch, and a river nearby that hummed like a lullaby. But this man across the fire was leaner, darker around the eyes. The soft edges of hope filed down to something harder, like the steel he wore on his belt. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he came back, why he didn't fight harder to stop his father before it happened, but every word caught in her throat like dry cotton. So instead she said the only thing she could, her voice so low it might have been mistaken for the wind. "He didn't hurt me the way you think." "Not all the way." Ethan's knife paused against the jerky, the blade still and sharp. "He never should have laid a finger on you," he said. "Not once, not ever." And it was the fierceness in that quiet that undid her. Her shoulders shook, her breath hitched, and tears she'd buried deep enough to build a house over started to slip down her face before she could stop them. Ethan didn't rush toward her, didn't shush her or reach out with pity. He just waited. Let her cry the way a storm rolls through the hills, steady and unashamed. When she finally looked up, her voice was raw. "Why did you let him take me? Why didn't you come sooner?" He stared into the fire a long time. "I thought I was dying," he said simply. "The bullet in my leg turned septic. They said I might lose it. I didn't want you saddled to a crippled man in the middle of nowhere, so I wrote your father and said I needed time, said you deserved better. I didn't know mine would turn that into a sale." Josephine's hands clenched around the blanket. "I wasn't something to be sold." "I know," he said. "That's why I came back. Not because I pitied you. Not because I wanted to fix what he broke, but because I made a promise in those letters. Because I meant it." She looked up then, into eyes that hadn't lost all their softness, and the flicker of something old and warm stirred inside her chest. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she whispered. "He took that from me. Every day I stayed, I felt myself turn into someone else." Ethan shook his head. "You're still you. You're still the woman who wrote me about canning peaches and planting wildflowers. The one who drew little horses in the margins and dreamed of a home with windows that faced the sun. He didn't take that. It's still in you." She laughed, bitter. "Maybe, but I can't feel it." "Then, let's find it," he said, "one step at a time." The fire popped, a coal breaking open. Josephine wiped her cheeks, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Where are we going?" she asked. Ethan looked up toward the distant ridge. "There's a cabin I built last spring, before I left for the army. It's rough, but it's mine. Ours, if you want it. No one knows it's there. We can stay until we figure out what comes next." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but I'm not someone's kept woman. I won't be passed from one man to another." "You're not," he said. "You never were. You're your own. I'm just here if you want company." She studied him again, and for the first time since she stepped off that train, she felt something begin to thaw. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the memory of it. Ethan tossed her a piece of jerky. She caught it with cold fingers, chewed in silence. The fire warmed her bones as the wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. And when she lay down beside the fire that night, her back to him but her breathing steady, Ethan didn't sleep. He stayed awake watching the flames, his hand resting lightly on the rifle across his knees, the weight of what he'd done and what he still had to do settling on him like snow that never melted. The cabin was smaller than she expected, tucked behind a thick bend of pine and boulder like it was ashamed to be found, its roof sagging slightly from snow it had once carried, and its shutters crooked like tired eyelids. But to Josephine, it looked like something solid, something that wouldn't be traded or stolen in the night. Ethan dismounted first, tied his horse to a low branch, then turned to help her down, his hands careful but not tentative, like he had learned not to flinch at the sight of bruises. She didn't wince when his fingers brushed her waist, but she didn't meet his eyes either. Not yet. The cabin's door groaned on its hinges as he pushed it open, letting in a square of pale morning light that stretched across a dust-coated floor, a single table, and a bed covered in rough wool. It smelled of pine pitch and thyme, the kind of place forgotten by maps but remembered by trees. Josephine stepped inside and let her fingers drift over the window ledge, the frame warped but still holding. "You built this?" she asked. "Every nail," Ethan said. "Cut the timber myself after the war. Figured I'd build something real before I ever sent for you." The silence that followed wasn't angry, it was heavy, but not sharp. She set her bag down, what little of it there was, and turned slowly in the room like she was measuring whether it could hold her pain without bursting at the seams. Ethan took his hat off, running a hand through his hair. "It's not much, I know, but the roof don't leak, and there's a creek nearby. Stove still works. I can fix the door and make room for you, if you want it." Josephine stared at the bed. "Where will you sleep?" "Floor, porch, saddle, wherever," he said with a shrug. "This is your space now." That word caught in her chest, your. She didn't know the last time someone had said it like that, without claim or pity. She sat on the edge of the bed, still stiff from riding, and pulled her shawl tighter. "I haven't felt safe in a long time," she whispered. "Not even in churches. Not with locks on the door." "You're safe here," Ethan said, leaning his rifle against the wall. "No one knows this place but me. No one will come without going through me first." There was a certainty in his voice that didn't need to shout. It settled around her like the warmth from the stove when he started a fire, the kind of warmth that took its time but promised not to vanish. He cooked eggs that afternoon, burnt slightly on the edges, but real, not powdered, and poured her coffee so strong it nearly scalded her tongue, but she drank it anyway, savoring the way the bitter bite made her feel alive again. After they ate, he went outside to chop firewood, and she stood at the window watching him, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight with focus, the axe rising and falling like some ancient rhythm of survival. There was something unspoken in the way he moved, not just strength, but guilt worn into the grooves of his shoulders, like he'd been carrying a weight that didn't belong to him, but he wouldn't set down either. By sundown, he had a neat stack of logs and a sweat-stained shirt hanging from a nail on the wall. She gave him a nod as he came back in, eyes tired but not unfriendly. That night, he laid out his bedroll by the door and turned his back as she undressed behind the quilt she'd hung like a curtain. The cabin creaked in the wind, but neither of them spoke. Sleep didn't come easy, her muscles ached, and the ghosts of hands that once gripped too hard still lingered on her skin. But when she woke before dawn, there was a pot of hot water waiting and a basin by the door. No words, just waiting warmth. She washed her face in silence, then watched him through the window again as he led his horse to the creek, his breath clouding in the cold, his figure cutting a tall shadow against the pink morning mist. She didn't know what she felt. Exactly safe wasn't quite right, and trust was too big a word, but she felt seen. Not stared at or claimed, but quietly witnessed. Like her broken edges weren't something to be fixed, but just carried, like weather-worn wood that still held firm. That evening, as he mended the loose shutter, she brought him a tin of stew, and when he looked up surprised, she just said, "Figured you needed to eat too." He smiled just a flicker, and she felt something shift inside her, something like breath after drowning. As darkness fell again, she didn't pull the quilt across the room, and he didn't look her way. But when she turned out the lantern, she lay facing his side of the cabin and listened to the rhythm of his breathing until it lulled her to sleep. Neither of them said goodnight, but in the hush of that small cabin, it felt like something had been spoken just the same. Ethan found it tucked behind a floorboard under the cot, wedged between dust and secrecy like it had been meant to rot away quietly. But the spine was still intact, and the leather cover bore his father's initials in a brand-like scrawled H. Rhodes. Josephine sat by the stove, stirring cornbread batter with one hand. her eyes following his every movement as he brought it to the table and opened it slowly, like each page might still bite. Inside were list names, dates, figures tallied in tight ink, sometimes red, sometimes black, and always cold. It wasn't just livestock and tools. There were women, towns listed beside them. And next to hers, Josephine T. Morathere, were 3 marks, 2 horses, 1 barrel of salt. He kept a record, Ethan muttered, eyes burning over the column. He put a price on people like they were sacks of oats. Josephine didn't move. Her stirring had stopped. He made me feel less than dirt, she whispered. But seeing it written down like that, it's like he knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't ignorance. It was math. Ethan's jaw clenched. He flipped through more pages, recognizing names of other women who had passed through their ranch, like Whisper's mail-order brides, who never stayed long, who left in the night or were sent off with bruises and silence. One entry had a line drawn through it with the words "damaged, refused" next to it, and Ethan's stomach turned as the ink blurred before him. "He's dead," Josephine said gently, but there was no softness in her voice, only finality. "There's no undoing it." "No," Ethan said, closing the book, "but I can make damn sure it's never forgotten." And never repeated. He walked outside and threw the ledger onto a pile of kindling, struck a match, and watched the pages curl into smoke, the numbers and names turning to ash in the wind. Josephine stood beside him, her arms crossed but her eyes locked on the flames like she was seeing something she hadn't let herself hope for. When the fire died down, Ethan turned to her. "I can't change what he did, but I can live in a way that shames his memory." "You already are," she said softly. "You came for me. That ledger burned the second you brought me here, instead of leaving me where he tossed me." They walked back inside together, and the silence between them now felt different, shared, not heavy. He took her hand for the first time, not in a way that asked, but in a way that simply offered. She didn't pull away. That night, a snowstorm rolled in with a howl, wind rattling the shutters and blanketing the world outside in white silence. But the cabin was warm from the fire, and the steady thrum of something building between them. Trust, maybe, or the faintest seed of something deeper. As the hours passed and the wind howled louder, Josephine stood at the window, watching the snow erase every trail that had led them here. "He's gone," she said, voice nearly lost in the storm. "But the world remembers men like him. His name carries weight in town. People look up to the Rhodes family. They won't want to believe what he did." Ethan stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Then they'll learn to believe something new. Starting with me." She looked at him, her face half lit by firelight, and nodded once, like a silent oath had just been spoken between them. By morning, the world was quiet again. The snow lay deep and undisturbed, a blank page. Josephine stepped outside first, boots crunching, breath steaming in the crisp air, and behind her Ethan followed. The mountains in the distance wore their white coats like kings, silent and watchful. "You ever thought about leaving all this?" she asked. "Starting over somewhere? No one knows your name?" Ethan looked out across the ridge. "Once, but I figured a man ought to fix the soil he was born into before he goes planting somewhere else. Otherwise, the rot follows." She didn't answer. But the way she looked at him made something shift deep in his chest, like the ice was cracking, and he didn't mind the thaw. That afternoon, he rode into town with Josephine's list the names of women she'd met on the train west, ones she'd heard stories about or shared glances with in silent understanding. Not to confront, not yet, but to gather threads. When he walked into the general store, heads turned. His father's shadow was long in these parts, but Ethan met their eyes one by one. "I'm not here for trade," he said, setting a folded paper on the counter. "I'm here to reckon." The clerk frowned. "Reckon what?" Ethan leaned in. "The debts my father left behind. And I don't mean coin." As he turned to leave, whispers followed, but no one stopped him. When he rode back through the forest, Josephine was on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a rifle across her lap. He smiled, and she raised an eyebrow. "Expecting trouble?" he asked. "Always," she said, "but not from you." The saloon doors creaked wide as Ethan stepped inside. the weight of his father's sins pressing on his back like a loaded rifle. Light from the low-burning sconces flickered against dusty bottles and scarred tables, catching on the eyes of men who remembered the road's name with reverence, fear, or both. He didn't go to the bar. He walked straight to the far table, where a man named Clay Grissom played cards with 3 ranch hands, his laughter low and liquor-laced. Clay had been Daniel Rhodes' right hand in everything land deals, cattle runs, and quiet trades no decent man asked about. He didn't look up when Ethan stood over him, not until Ethan reached out and flipped over Clay's cards without a word. The saloon went still. Clay's smile curdled. "You got a death wish, boy?" Ethan didn't blink. "I got questions." "Then you should have brought whiskey, not fists." "I brought both," Ethan said, pulling the bottle from his coat and placing it between them. The others slid their chairs back, instinctively sensing something bigger than a card game taking root. Clay leaned back, eyeing Ethan with a gambler's grin. "All right. What you want to know, son of Daniel?" "How many women did he trade?" Clay's smirk faded, but he covered it with a sip. "Why ask me? You were under that roof long enough. You didn't see it?" "I was 17, Ethan growled. "He kept me in the barn more than the house. He didn't want me knowing the weight of his boots until I could fill them." Clay nodded slowly. "That sounds like him. Tell me about Josephine." "Ah," Clay said, drawing the word out like a blade from its sheath. "Pretty little freight. He was proud of that trade. Said he got her for 2 horses and a kiss of salt. Meant it to humiliate. The matchmaker told her he didn't pay coin for lies." Ethan's fist curled on the table. "He gave her to a man who beat her bloody the second he got home." Clay shrugged. "That man gave Daniel a favor in return control of a southern rail spur. You were raised on blood deals, Rhodes. Don't act surprised you finally tasted it." Ethan slammed his fist on the table. "I ain't my father." "Then prove it," Clay said, voice low now, gaze locked. "You burn his ledger, fine. You ride out for a girl, good on you. But this town still bows to his memory. Until you drag every truth into the daylight, his ghost owns you." Ethan stood there, a long beat, breath heavy, the bottle untouched between them. Then he turned and walked out, the floorboards groaning under his boots, like they remembered the weight of another Rhodes, long gone. Back at the cabin, Josephine was stitching the sleeve of a wool coat, her fingers nimble despite the bruises still shadowing her wrists. Ethan didn't speak as he sat beside her. He simply watched her work, the quiet rhythm of thread and fabric more grounding than any sermon. Finally, she looked up. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found out who he really was," Ethan said, "and who I never want to be." She nodded like she'd already known. "And what now?" "We make noise," he said. "Not with guns, with the truth." That night, he wrote letters, dozens of them, to the matchmakers, to the circuit judges, to the mayor who once toasted Daniel Rhodes' name like it was holy. He didn't beg or accuse. He told the truth plainly, and he signed his name at the bottom with no apology. Josephine watched him seal each envelope with wax and ash, the smoke curling like an omen over the cabin. "You really think it'll change anything?" she asked. "I think silence is what lets men like him live twice," Ethan said. "Once when they walk, and once when no one speaks after they're gone." Days passed. The town stirred. Some letters were laughed at, others folded into drawers, but one ended up on the desk of a woman named Constance Alden, the editor of the Deadwood Ledger. She rode in on a gray mare, her boots dusty and eyes sharp behind wire spectacles, asking only one question when she arrived at Ethan's porch. "You ready to speak into a storm?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I've lived inside one my whole life." Constance opened her satchel. "Then tell me everything." Josephine sat beside him, her voice shaking only once when she described the train station, the man who yanked her arm like she was a bundle of pelts, the cold nights she spent staring at the ceiling, trying to remember her mother's face so she wouldn't forget who she was. Ethan told her about the ledger, the trade agreements hidden inside, the nights he lay awake as a boy hearing sobs through floorboards he wasn't allowed to walk on. Constance took it all down, every word. When she left, Josephine gripped Ethan's hand tightly. "If they come for us, then let them come," he said, voice calm as winter. "We'll greet them with truth and fire if they insist." And from the hills beyond the ranch, riders were already stirring, old names resurfacing, debts once buried now aching to be settled. The storm had been waiting, and Ethan had just lit its match. The sun hadn't yet broken over the hills when Ethan rode out, the old leather-bound ledger in his saddlebag like a cursed relic, pages crackling with the weight of every sin his father ever bartered. Josephine stood in the doorway, wrapped in Ethan's wool coat, her hair braided back like armor. And he met her eyes for just a second longer than he meant to, before turning his horse toward the canyon where no one went unless they had something to bury. The wind whistled through the rocks like a warning, but he didn't hesitate. Not when he dismounted at the base of the slope. Not when he drew the book from the bag and set it atop a pile of dry cedar branches. His hands trembled only once when he touched the page, marked with Josephine's name, written in a blunt scrawl between the words, 2 mares and barrel salt. His jaw clenched, his breath caught, and then he struck the match. The fire caught slow, licking the edge like it wasn't sure it wanted the truth, and then it roared up all at once, pages curling into black ash, names and dates crumbling into smoke, as if the West itself was trying to forget what had been done in its name. Ethan didn't speak. He just watched. Watched until there was nothing left but char and wind and silence, so thick it felt like penance. But the past didn't die with flame, not when the canyon walls echoed with hoofbeats behind him. He turned, slowly, hand instinctively brushing the butt of his revolver, though he didn't draw it. 3 riders. One was Caleb Voss, a man who'd once run cattle for Daniel Rhodes and now ran guns through border towns with a twitchy smile and no loyalty to anyone not paying him. The others Ethan didn't know, but their guns weren't holstered and their eyes said they weren't here for talk. "Heard you been stirring ghosts, Rhodes," Caleb called as he rode closer, his horse kicking up the ash. "Ledger's gone. Truth's out," Ethan said flatly. "Nothing left for you to protect. Truth don't matter to men who still live by Daniel's law," Caleb said, dismounting. "Some of us still owe him favors, or still fear what happens if his secrets die without payment." "Then, let's settle the debt," Ethan said, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. The canyon was silent again. The other 2 men looked to Caleb, but the outlaw only smiled and shook his head. "Not today, boy. Not yet. Just wanted you to know we're watching." And then he turned his horse, mounted slow, and left with dust in his wake. Ethan waited until they vanished, before holstering his gun, but his heart beat hard against his ribs like it was trying to punch its way free. He rode home under a burning sky, the horizon bruised with stormlight, and when Josephine saw him ride in, she didn't ask what happened. She just walked out into the yard, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said, "I smelled smoke." "It was time," he said. "It won't stop them," she whispered. "No," he admitted, "but it gives us a place to stand." That night, they didn't light a lamp. They sat in the dark, backs against the cabin wall, her head resting on his shoulder, as the wind moved through the eaves like it was looking for something to carry away. Josephine spoke first. "You ever think about just leaving? Selling the land, riding east, starting where no one knows your name?" "I did once," he said. "But now I've got something worth staying for." She was quiet, but her hand found his and held it, firm and warm. Like maybe for the first time in her life, she believed someone might mean that. The next day, Constance Alden's article came out. Front page of the Deadwood Ledger, bold letters naming Daniel Rhodes, naming every bride-for-horse deal, every land swindle, every lawman bought with salt or coin. And at the bottom, the name Ethan Rhodes signed in full. It was a death sentence and a revolution, all in one. Mail riders carried copies across the counties. One ended up in the hands of a marshal who remembered losing his sister to a stranger's marriage offer. One reached a preacher who'd buried girls he wasn't allowed to name in sermons. And one arrived in the hands of an old woman who'd once been traded for a sack of flour and had never spoken a word of it until now. That night, fires lit in 3 towns, not of violence but of Truth Ranch ledgers burned, contracts torn, matchmaker offices emptied by women with rage in their eyes. And in the hills above them all, Caleb Voss read the article by lantern light, his lips twisting around Ethan's name like a bad taste he couldn't spit out. "So the boy wants to be a hero," he muttered. "Then let's see if he bleeds like one." Beside him, a man with eyes like glass loaded a rifle and said nothing. The storm Ethan had lit was gathering more than wind now, and the canyon would not be empty next time. They came at dawn, when the mist still clung low across the pasture, and the chickens had not yet stirred. 5 riders in a wedge, hooves pounding like war drums against the quiet earth, and Josephine felt it in her bones before she saw them, her breath hitching as she stepped from the cabin and saw Ethan already standing by the fence, with his rifle resting across one forearm, not raised, not yet, but steady like he'd been waiting for this moment since the day he watched his father trade her for horses. "Stay inside," he said without looking back. But she didn't move, didn't flinch, not even when one of the riders dismounted and came forward with slow, swaggering steps and a grin that split his face like a wound. "Ethan Rhodes," the man said, hat tipped low, scar running down from brow to cheek like a river cut through granite. "You've made yourself a real thorn." "Didn't know telling the truth was considered sabotage," Ethan replied, voice calm but sharp. "You bring your argument, or just your gang?" "Just a message," the man said, then snapped his fingers. One of the riders brought forward a burlap sack, and when he opened it, Ethan saw the unmistakable glint of silver and brass bullets, polished and labeled with names. His and Josephine's were among them. "Courtesy of Caleb Voss. You've got till Sunday to leave these lands. After that, the names become real." Josephine took a step forward, ignoring Ethan's outstretched arm. "Tell Caleb," she said, her voice cold as the iron stove, "that if he wants to finish what Daniel Rhodes started, he best bring more than hired guns. He better bring the devil himself." The man laughed, but there was unease behind it, like her words had teeth. "Suit yourself," he said, tipping his hat again as he mounted. "Hope your husband can dig fast graves." And then they were gone, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a fuse already lit. Ethan turned to her slowly. "You weren't supposed to speak," he said softly. "And let them think I'm still some girl who needs saving?" she snapped. "You lit this fire, Ethan, but I'm the one they burned." He didn't argue, only nodded. And for the rest of the morning, they worked in silence, boarding the windows, laying traps along the north slope, oiling rifles. At one point, Josephine caught Ethan staring off toward the old barn, eyes distant. "What is it?" she asked. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said finally. "Before Pa sold you, there was another girl, younger. She never made it off the property." Josephine felt her breath catch. "What happened to her?" "She ran," he said. "Middle of the night. Pa said she was ungrateful, said he was gonna make an example. Next morning, I found her body by the creek, and the horse that tried to carry her, shot in the head." Josephine's hand covered her mouth, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan said, "That horse had a name, Mercy." That night, while the world slept, Josephine went out to the barn and whispered the name, Mercy, like a prayer. Inside, in the farthest stall, was a gray mare with old scars across her flanks and fire still in her eyes. Ethan had rescued her years ago. Now Josephine saddled her slow, not to run but to ride into the hills, to a place she hadn't spoken of since that first week where the Lakota woman lived. The one who'd wrapped her wounds in silence and herbs and asked for nothing but her truth. Josephine found her by the fire, braiding sweet grass, and without a word, the old woman stood, walked inside, and returned with a single eagle feather, placing it in Josephine's hand. "You are not just wife," she said in halting English. "You are storm." On the ride back, Josephine tucked the feather into her braid, and something shifted inside her, something that didn't belong to the girl who stepped off the train or the woman traded like stock. She arrived before dawn, Mercy's hooves silent in the fog, and Ethan was waiting on the porch, eyes full of questions. But she only said, "I'm ready." That Sunday, when the riders came back, they found a different homestead, flags of cloth tied to trees, traps laid with cunning, a woman standing not behind a man but beside him, holding a rifle with hands that no longer trembled. Caleb Voss wasn't among the riders, but they carried his words, his threat, his arrogance like a badge. "Last chance," said the man with the scar. "Last breath," Josephine replied, and fired the first shot. The fight was over in minutes. 3 men down, 2 crawling off, blood on snow and smoke in the air. Ethan took a graze to the shoulder, but Josephine stood untouched, and when it ended, she walked to the body of the man who'd mocked her voice and whispered, "This is for Mercy." The name echoed between the trees like a promise. That night, they buried the bullets that had carried their names and replaced them with seeds. Spring would come, but not before the storm. The wind changed on the 3rd morning after the fight, and with it came the smell, thick, sharp, unnatural, like scorched oil and smoldering leather. And Josephine stepped out of the cabin just as Ethan came racing up from the south ridge, hat in one hand. Sweat and ash streaked across his face. "They burned the outpost," he said, breath ragged. "The one with the telegraph line." She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Caleb Voss had decided bullets weren't enough. Now he wanted to cut them off from the world, the cabin, the land, even their names. But the thing about fire is, it doesn't know when to stop, and sometimes it burns the hand that strikes the match. Josephine saddled Mercy in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't wait for Ethan's approval. "We ride to town," she said, cinching the straps. "We tell the marshal. We say his silence makes him part of this." "He won't listen," Ethan muttered, mounting beside her. "Then we make him," she said. "With truth. And blood, if we have to." It took them 4 hours to reach the valley floor, and by then the air was thick with ash, coating their tongues, stinging their eyes. The telegraph station was nothing but a blackened husk, the wires hanging like dead snakes from charred poles. One of the Voss men had been too drunk or too slow. His boot stuck out from beneath a collapsed beam, and the buzzards circled low. In town, folks parted like water when they saw Josephine. She wore her scars like a crown now, the bruises faded but not forgotten, the eagle feather braided into her hair, her rifle slung low and visible. She didn't walk like a bride. She walked like consequence. The marshal sat behind his desk, in a lazy sprawl, boots up, chewing something bitter. "What do you want?" he asked, not looking up. Ethan reached into his saddlebag and threw down a bundle maps, shell casings, the names carved into bullets. "Justice," Josephine said, "or the nearest thing to it." "I don't take sides in family feuds," the marshal grunted. "Not unless they spill into my streets." "They already have," she replied, voice sharp. "Or did you think the Voss boys were just setting fires for fun?" He looked up then, eyes narrowing. "And what am I supposed to do? Ride out there with 6 deputies and pray we make it back?" Josephine leaned in, close enough he could smell the smoke still clinging to her skin. "You don't have to make it back. You just have to ride out there and let them know their time's up." There was a pause so heavy it seemed to stretch the walls. Then the marshal sat forward, boot heels thudding to the floor. "You get me proof, witnesses, and I'll give you 3 men and a badge to carry." It wasn't a promise. It was a wager. And Josephine had already bet her soul. On the ride back, Ethan was quiet until they reached the ridgeline. Then he said, "You ever think about running?" She didn't answer right away. "I used to," she said finally, "back when I thought I was the only one worth saving." That night, as they sat by the fire, a shadow approached from the east. Josephine had her rifle in hand before the figure called out, "Peace." It was the Lakota woman, wrapped in dark wool, eyes glittering like flint. She sat without invitation, pulled a bundle from her cloak, and unwrapped a red cloth. Inside was a carved piece of bonia whistle. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "Old signal," the woman said. "Used when tribes called for watchers, to see without being seen." "A scout," Josephine said, taking it in her hand. The woman nodded. "They watch you now. Many eyes. Some old, some angry, some waiting." "Why are you helping us?" Ethan asked. The woman looked at Josephine. "Because she did not forget. Pain is one thing. Forgetting is worse." And with that, she rose and vanished into the trees. Josephine held the whistle all night. At dawn, she blew it once. A single sharp note that vanished into the hills. She didn't know who would hear, but she knew someone would. Caleb Voss was coming. That much was clear. But now, so was something else. So was she. The girl who'd stepped off the train was long gone, and in her place stood a woman forged by silence, by smoke, by the weight of names whispered over bullet casings. When she looked at the land now, she didn't see what they'd tried to take. She saw what they could never kill, what the fire didn't burn. The sky cracked open with thunder the night Caleb Voss came down from the hills, bringing with him 6 riders and a storm so thick it turned the dust to paste beneath their hooves. The town held its breath as the posse passed through, slow and deliberate, each man cloaked in oilskin and malice, rifles slung high like bones waiting for blood. Josephine watched them from the upstairs window of the livery's loft, her hands curled around the same rifle Ethan had taught her to clean in silence. Beside her, Ethan loaded shells with methodical calm, every movement soaked in history he didn't speak of, the kind written in the margins of old wanted posters and sealed with broken teeth. "They'll come at first light," he said, pressing a round into place, "same way they always did back home, before Pa put a price on my name." "We don't have enough men," she said flatly. "Doesn't matter," he answered. "We've got the land, and we've got reason." At dawn the street was empty but for the thunder clouds above and the smell of iron on the wind. Josephine stood in the center of the road, rifle at her side, braid tight, boots planted like roots, the Lakota whistle tucked into her coat. Ethan flanked her left. Marshal Darby and 2 townsmen stood on her right, shaky but present, their shotguns a whisper compared to what was coming. When Caleb Voss rode into view, he didn't dismount. He sat tall on his gray horse, black coat flapping like the wings of a crow, and behind him his men spread wide like a net. "Boy," he said, voice low and cruel, "you came back to the wrong place with the wrong woman." Ethan stepped forward. "I came back to bury your name." Caleb smirked. "You ain't man enough to lift the shovel." "Maybe not," Ethan said, "but she is." And Josephine raised her rifle without shaking, the barrel leveled at the man who'd sold her like livestock, who'd made her body a ledger of bruises, who'd turned love into barter and blood into currency. "You're going to ride out," she said, "or we're going to plant you here. Your choice." "You think the badge makes you safe?" Caleb sneered. "You think that piece of tin means something?" She stepped forward. "No, but I do." The wind caught her words and flung them through the street like a promise. Caleb's smile vanished. His hand twitched. And that's when the whistle blew. From the rooftops, from the ridgelines, from every shadow that had watched silently for weeks. One by one, figures emerged. Lakota, former scouts, ranch hands armed with hammers and hearts full of justice. They surrounded the posse like wolves closing in on a wounded stag. Caleb's men hesitated. One dropped his reins. Another backed away slow. "You going to start a war, old man?" Ethan called out. "Are you going to die in one?" Caleb turned, spit into the dirt, and drew his pistol. The shot rang out before he could fire. Josephine's rifle kicked against her shoulder, and Caleb's chest exploded in red. He crumpled without drama, without last words, his body hitting the mud with a sound that wasn't even worth remembering. Silence fell. Then movement. His men dropped their weapons one by one, hands raised, eyes wide-knot at Herbert at what had risen behind her. Justice, truth, something they couldn't unsee. She lowered the rifle and let the breath escape her chest like smoke, leaving a long burning fire. Later, when the bodies were cleared and the sky finally opened with rain, Josephine sat on the porch of the old trading post, now a free house for women who'd survived what she had. Ethan handed her a mug of coffee and sat beside her in the rocking chair, arms bandaged, knuckles split. "You didn't flinch," he said quietly. "Neither did you," she replied. "Didn't have a reason to," he murmured. "Not when you were standing there." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not just the son of a monster, not just the boy who had once turned away, but the man who rode back for her anyway, who stood in the rain with a broken past and offered her a different ending. "So what now?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out the eagle feather and tied it into his rifle strap. "Now," she said, "we teach others how to shoot." And as the rain washed away the ash from the rooftops and the wind swept through the canyon with a kind of relief, Josephine stood again, no longer a traded bride, no longer a scarred secret but a name the West would remember, a reckoning, A beginning. A woman who was worth the ride back. They buried Caleb Voss without ceremony, without a prayer, just a crude wooden plank hammered into the mud with a name carved by a man who didn't care if it faded. Josephine didn't attend the burial. She stood on the bluff above the canyon, watching the wind bend the long grass like 1,000 whispers of every woman that man had wronged. She'd never wanted revenge. Not really. But standing there, one hand resting on the eagle feather, now tied into the strap of Ethan's rifle, she understood that justice and peace weren't the same and maybe never would be. Below, Ethan emerged from the barn, leading his mare with slow steps, the kind that showed he'd walked both sides of a man's path. The one his father had carved in cruelty, and the one he now chose every day beside her. The town was quiet, but not dead. It pulsed with a new breath, slow and uncertain, as if no one quite knew what life after shame should look like. The women from the hills had come down after the shooting, led by Gray Owl and Old Mary, and now they helped board up the old trading post. But not to seal it shut, to turn it into a shelter, a place where no woman ever slept behind locked doors or lay awake wondering what her worth was. Josephine helped build it, brick by brick, but she kept her distance from the crowds. The townsfolk nodded when they saw her. Some offered thanks, others shame. She didn't return the gestures. Not yet. That morning, Ethan found her cleaning the same rifle for the third time. He didn't say anything, just leaned in the doorway and watched her hands, the way they moved steady, practiced, strong. "We could leave," he said softly. "Take the road south. Find a patch of land no one's died on yet." She paused, eyes on the oiled barrel, then looked up. "And start over?" "Yeah," he said. "If you want that." She smiled. Not the kind that showed teeth, but the kind that settled deep. "I don't want to start over. I want to keep going." He stepped forward, took her hand, rifle still between them. "Then let's keep going. Together." That night, they lit a fire behind the old post, where the grass dipped into the valley and the wind didn't howl like it used to. They sat close, shoulder to shoulder, neither needing to speak much. Sometimes, silence said more than promises. "I used to dream of running," she said. "Of trains, of rivers, anything that moved." He glanced at her. "And now?" She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, the marriage certificate. Stained, half-torn, signed by a man now buried beneath 6 inches of mud. "Now I want to rewrite this," she said. "Not because I need a man to fix what was done, but because I want to choose you, not out of desperation, not out of fear, but because you rode back for me when you could have stayed gone." Ethan didn't speak. He just took the paper, tore it once, twice, 3 times, then let the wind scatter it into ash. "We'll write a new one," he said. "One that starts here, in this place, on our terms." Days turned into weeks. The post became a sanctuary, a school, a refuge. Women came with broken hearts and calloused hands, with children on their hips and stories buried in their bones. Josephine taught them how to shoot, how to speak without trembling, how to name the things they feared and walk through them anyway. And beside her, Ethan built fences, dug wells, and when the sun set, he braided her hair in silence, his fingers gentle, reverent, grateful. One evening, as spring crawled up from the roots and the snow melted off the mountains, a rider came from the east. A young girl on a paint pony, wide-eyed and wild, clutching a paper like it might burn in her hands. Josephine met her at the gate. "They're selling again," the girl whispered. "Over near Barlow. 4 women. One's with child." Josephine didn't flinch. She turned, called for Ethan, and within minutes the rifles were packed. No one asked her if she was ready. No one tried to stop her, because now they understood. She wasn't the woman who'd stepped off the train. She was the woman the West remembered, the one who'd been traded and then rose. Ethan rode beside her, the feather at his strap catching the sun, and in the distance the hills stretched open like a door that would never close again. They rode through the pale dawn with frost still clinging to the tall grass, the sky cracking open in shades of bruised lavender and fire, and not once did Josephine look back at the place she'd been broken. The road ahead wasn't smooth, And it wasn't safer ruts carved deep by wagon wheels and old violence, coyotes howling at their backs like ghosts, still trying to call her by the name of fear, but her spine stayed straight, her eyes steady. Beside her, Ethan rode in silence, rifle slung across his back and hand never far from hers. Not as a guard, not as an owner, but as a vow. The girl had led them past Barlow's edge, where hills folded like sleeping beasts, and the wind carried stories the soil hadn't yet swallowed. There, at the base of a crumbling ridge, stood a lean-to made of stolen wood and tarp, guarded by 3 men with cruel eyes and twitchy hands. One of them smoked, one cleaned his nails with a blade, and the third, the tallest, watched the girls behind the fence like they were cattle waiting to be weighed. Josephine saw the woman with child first barefoot, dirt on her dress, one hand curled around her belly like she was holding back the world. The others were younger, too young, and in that moment, Josephine didn't feel fear, didn't feel fury. She felt purpose, the kind that burns cold and bright, like moonlight on a knife. Ethan looked at her, waiting. She nodded once, slow, then dismounted with the grace of a woman who no longer asked permission to breathe. They walked into that camp like they owned the dust beneath their boots. The tallest man stepped forward, sneering. "Turn back, missy. Ain't no welcome here for saviors." Josephine kept walking. "Didn't come to save. Came to collect." He laughed, loud and mean, but there was unease behind it. The way a man laughs when he senses the storm but hasn't yet felt the thunder. "You think you got claim?" Josephine stopped 3 paces from him. "No, but I've got a name. And around these parts, that used to mean something. My name's Josephine Voss, and I was traded for horses. But not again. Not ever again." The laughter died. His hand twitched near his belt, but Ethan raised the rifle just enough. Not a threat, a promise. "You're Caleb's girl," the tall man muttered. "Heard he died like a pig in the dirt." Josephine smiled. "He did, but pigs don't bury themselves." The man didn't reach for his gun. He backed up. Not because he feared death, but because he finally saw the kind of woman who survives being bought and doesn't break. One of the younger girls behind the fence began to cry, softly, like the sound of something thawing after a long, bitter freeze. Josephine turned to her. "You don't belong here. You never did." She stepped to the gate, found the rusted bolt, and wrenched it free. Ethan moved behind her, covering the others as they fled the pen like startled deer, unsure if freedom was real. The pregnant woman hesitated. "Where will we go?" she whispered. Josephine touched her shoulder. "With us, where no one owns your name but you." By sundown, the fire was lit again at the sanctuary, smoke curling into the orange dusk, as women gathered to lay out blankets, bread, and balm. The new girls sat close together, eyes wide, hands still trembling from what they'd escaped. Josephine didn't press them. She remembered that silence, that shame. She knew healing came not in questions, but in patience. That night, Ethan pulled her aside. "You keep doing this," he said, brushing soot from her sleeve. "Running headfirst into fires you didn't start." She looked at him, the light catching the scar on her cheek like a medal she never asked for. "If I don't," she said, "who will?" He kissed her then, slow and reverent, as if she were something holy rising from the ashes. Months passed, seasons shifted. The sanctuary became more than a place, it became a force. Rumors spread across the West about a woman who'd once been bought, but now bought others their freedom. Traders whispered her name like a warning. Women whispered it like a prayer. And when girls arrived in the dead of night, barefoot and hollow-eyed, they'd ask only one thing: "Is she real? The one with the rifle and the fire?" The answer was always the same: "She is. Her name is Josephine." The fire burned low in the grate, casting flickers across the wooden walls of the sanctuary as Josephine sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, steam curling like ghosts from the rim. Outside, snow had begun to fall quiet, heavy flakes that blanketed the hard edges of the world and made even the cruelest scars seem softer. The girls slept in clusters near the stove, bundled in old quilts, their breathing the only sound in the silence that came after survival. Ethan stood at the door, one hand resting on the frame, eyes watching the road like it might rise up and bite. There'd been rumors that the last traitor she'd burned had a brother, that the price of a woman's name spoken too loudly was blood, that something was coming. She'd felt it too in her bones, in the way the wind cut different lately, like it knew. The sanctuary had grown, word spreading faster than wagons could travel. But with that came danger. Every woman saved was a secret someone wanted to bury again. Every name remembered was a chain broken, and men who made their living on shackles didn't let go easy. Josephine set the mug down and crossed the floor, her bare feet silent on the wood. "You smell it?" she asked Ethan, voice low. He nodded. "Gun oil. And fear. They're close." She didn't ask how many. Didn't need to. Some instincts bloom after enough pain, and hers had bloomed like thorny vines around her ribs. She touched the rifle leaning by the door, the one Ethan had carried the night he rode back for her, and slung it over her shoulder like a memory made of steel. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the snow. 5 riders crested the hill, dark shapes against the white, their horses restless, their coats heavy with purpose. One rode ahead of the others, tall, face wrapped in a red scarf, eyes like cracked glass. He stopped 20 paces from the porch, boots crunching into frozen earth as he dismounted, and pulled the scarf down. His mouth was twisted in something too cruel to be called a smile. "You the one calls herself Voss?" Josephine didn't blink. "I don't call myself anything, but others do." He spat. "My brother died crying in the mud because of you." She stepped forward, rifle resting against her spine like a spine of its own. "Then he died free. That's more than most like you deserve." The man's eyes flicked to Ethan, who'd stepped out behind her, revolver drawn. Then to the windows, where candlelight flickered behind frightened eyes. "You keep hiding them," he said, voice rising. "Girls that don't belong to you. Wives that ran. Daughters promised. You think that makes you a hero?" Josephine's voice was calm as falling snow. "I don't care what they call me. I just care that they make it through the night." He laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You think you're changing something. This land doesn't forget what it's worth. Everything's got a price, Missy. Even you." She stepped off the porch, walked 10 paces into the snow. "Then name it," she said. "Tell me what my name costs. I'll pay it, but not in fear." He drew his gun. So did his men. Ethan's breath caught, but Josephine didn't flinch. And in the stillness, something shifted. A door creaked open behind them. Then another, and another. Women stepped into the cold, barefoot, quiet, and unafraid. One carried a knife. Another an old axe. The youngest held a pitchfork like it was a sword. The pregnant woman placed her hand on her stomach and stood taller. Josephine didn't have to speak. Her silence was louder than any war cry. The riders froze, unease rippling through them like wind through grass. "You want to take something?" she said. "Then take it from all of us." The man stared at her, then at the others. Then he backed away, spitting curses into the snow, fury beaten down by something stronger than forced conviction. "This ain't the end," he hissed. "This place won't stand forever." Josephine let him go. Not out of mercy, but because she knew he was wrong. It would stand. Not because the walls were strong, but because the women inside were. She turned back toward the house, the cold settling into her bones, but her chest warm with something fiercer than fire. Ethan met her halfway. "That could have gone worse." She nodded. "But it didn't." "Why?" he asked. "Why did they listen?" She looked back at the women, her women. "Because I've stopped being the only one with a name. Now we all have one. And men like that, they don't know how to fight women who remember who they are." Inside, the girls returned to their blankets. The wind howled against the boards, but the house stood firm. In the dark, a child whispered, "Tell us again, her name." And someone answered, soft and sure, "Josephine." They came by wagon now, not in ones or twos, but in clusters. Each one a bruised story wrapped in shawls and soot and silence. Their faces hollowed by miles and betrayal. Their eyes carrying questions they no longer dared speak aloud. Josephine stood at the edge of the old riverbed, boots sinking into damp clay, watching a girl no older than 15 lower herself into the cold water, hands trembling as she scrubbed the blood from her skirt with a rock she'd likely used once to defend herself. Behind her, Ethan stitched the roof of the new cabin, his hands raw and ungloved, his face smudged with ash and effort, while two boys' brothers found hiding in a hayloft stacked firewood like it was the only thing keeping their minds from shattering. The sanctuary had grown into a village now, but no one called it that. It had no sign, no sheriff, no preacher, only a code etched into every pair of eyes that met hers. You don't owe what was taken, only what you choose to give. Josephine had stopped counting the women. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that they woke up and the doors were still open, that no rider had crested the ridge with a price on her head, that the babies born now came into a world where the first hands that held them didn't tremble with fear. Yet that morning, she'd found a note nailed to the oak post near the barn. A debt is still a debt. You were traded once. Some men don't forget what they paid. No name, just the message, and a feather dipped in dried blood tucked behind it. Josephine folded the paper and tucked it into her coat without a word. But the wind carried more than chill that afternoon. It carried the scent of iron and smoke, so she called a meeting. In the dusk, every woman came. Some held tools, some held children. All stood like carved stone in a circle beneath the sky, the firelight dancing across old wounds and newer strength. Josephine stood in the center, her voice clear. Someone thinks this place still belongs to the men who started our pain. Someone thinks shame is a leash. A murmur passed. Not fear not anymore. Just the weight of resolve. We don't know when they'll come, but they will. And I need to know you're ready. A woman named Esther, who once spoke only in whispers, lifted her chin. We've been ready since the day you gave us our names back. Josephine nodded. Then we fight without fighting. We resist by living. We meet their rage with walls they can't burn and eyes they can't shake. And in that moment, it wasn't a speech. It was a promise. That night, Josephine didn't sleep. She sat at the hearth with a rifle across her lap, and her wedding ring, the one she'd been forced to wear, melted down into the shape of a pendant that hung around her neck. A symbol, not of what she'd lost, but of what she'd reclaimed. At dawn, the sound camhooves, dozens, thudding like thunder in the ribs of the earth. She stepped outside, eyes narrowing. Men in coats of dust, guns slung low, rode down the slope like ghosts of every man who'd ever treated a woman as property. The leader wore a silver spur on one boot and a tooth around his neck. You, Josephine? He called, smiling like he already owned the outcome. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked forward until they could see the scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, the one his brother had given her. She saw the flicker in his eyes, then not of shame, but recognition. That trade was legal, he sneered. 2 horses and a barrel. I paid full. Josephine's voice was quiet. Then you should have bought something that didn't have a soul. Laughter behind him. The kind men bark out before they hurt something. But when he stepped forward, he found not just Josephine waiting. Behind her, one by one, the women stepped from the shadows of cabins, from behind hay bales, from beneath porches. None wore dresses. All wore grit. Everyone held something: rifles, knives, tools turned into weapons. And beside them stood the children, tall and unflinching, taught by the women who refused to let them inherit fear. The leader hesitated. He'd come for shame, for silence, for surrender. But this was something else. This was resistance carved out of sorrow and rage and quiet, stubborn hope. You can leave, Josephine said. You won't get your horses back, but you'll keep your blood inside your body. That's more than you gave me. He looked around, and for the first time in his life, he was outnumbered, not by men, but by women who refused to flinch. He spit in the dirt, turned, and rode. His men followed, some laughing, others not. And when the dust cleared, Josephine let her breath go. She turned to Ethan, who stood with his hand clenched white on the cabin door. He'll be back, he said. Maybe, she replied. But so will the ones we're meant to save. And she walked back into the house where bread was rising, where stories were waiting to be told, where a girl just yesterday traded for a sack of flour was now learning how to read, because this was where the river bent not around them, but for them. The desert winds howled like old warnings, and every shutter in the sanctuary clattered As the final night fell, a night Josephine knew might decide whether their village would become a graveyard or something far rarer. A legend. She hadn't told the others what she'd seen on the ridge 2 days prior, hadn't spoken a word about the circle of vultures wheeling slow above the horizon, or the burned-out post marked with a symbol carved in blood and ash. A trader's brand crossed by a dagger. It meant only one thing. The debt collectors weren't done. But this time, they weren't coming to reclaim horses. They were coming to burn down the proof that a woman could rise after being bartered like livestock. So Josephine packed bags beneath the floorboards for the youngest ones, mapped out escape routes through the mesquite brush, and placed 2 rifles at every entry point of the compound. She told herself they might not come, that perhaps the humiliation of being turned away by women had been enough. But she knew men like that, knew they only grew more dangerous when their pride was wounded. The kind who'd trade bullets for dignity and fire for memory. Still, she didn't flinch, not when the sky turned the color of rust, not when the moon rose like a blade through smoke, not even when the dogs began barking low and deep, the way they had the night she was first handed off like freight, years and lifetimes ago. This time, she stood with a badge no lawman gave her, a badge forged from her own blood and bone, the eyes of the women behind her, the hands of children clutching her skirts, the voice she now spoke with that never trembled. They came at midnight, 8 riders, no torches, no flags, just the creak of saddles and the gleam of weapons against moonlight. The one in front wore black gloves and no face only, a scarf pulled tight and eyes that shone silver with hunger. He dismounted first, walked forward with the slow certainty of someone who thought he was death in human skin. "This the place where women play sheriff?" he called. Josephine didn't move. "This the place where men think graves only hold cowards?" He grinned. "You talk big for something bought with salt and horses, and you talk too much for someone who should have stayed dead with his brother." That wiped the grin. The other men shifted. Ethan stepped to her side, hand on his rifle, but Josephine raised hers first. "No shots," she said. "Not unless they raise theirs." She turned back to the faceless man. "What do you want?" He gestured behind him. "What's owed? The woman who ran, the land she hides on, the boy who stabbed my cousin, and the name you stole when you turned the ones we owned into something else." The word sliced like a blade. Owned. Josephine let it hang in the cold air like a challenge. "You don't own people," she said. "Not anymore. The law says—" "Which law?" she snapped. "The one written by thieves? By traders who buy human flesh and call it a contract?" He stepped forward. Ethan's rifle lifted, then froze, because the man had pulled a girl from behind his horse. Young, maybe 12, bruised, gagged. She staggered in the dirt, her eyes wide, pleading. "She's ours too," he said. "Unless you want her shot." Josephine's chest tightened, but she didn't move. "What's her name?" "Doesn't matter." "It does to me." He blinked, confused. "Why?" "Because we don't bury girls without knowing what to carve on the stone." The silence cracked. Then a voice from the cabin. "Esther's. Her name's Amara. I saw her in Wichita. She was chained to a post beside pigs." Another voice. "She's the one whose mother slit her own wrists so she wouldn't be sold again." Josephine stepped forward. "She's not going with you." The man laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then she dies now." But as he raised his pistol, a sound split the night. Hooves. Behind them, dozens. No one expected it. Not Josephine, not the riders. But over the ridge came a line of figuresome on horseback, some on foot, all armed. Some bore braids, others bore scars. Former captives. Outlaws turned guardians. Traders' sons turned rebels. And at the front rode a boy barely 20, with eyes like flint and a rifle carved with his mother's name. The son of the woman traded for horses. Josephine felt something crack open. He hadn't left. He'd only gone to gather the forgotten, to bring back everyone the desert tried to erase. The masked man cursed, turned to run. But the circle was closed now, and no one who came for blood would leave with anything less than justice. Josephine raised her voice. "We're not waiting to be saved anymore. We are the fire. We are the memory. And tonight, you ride back with nothing. When it ended, no bullets flew. The riders left the girl behind, left their pride in the dirt, left their mark on history as the men who tried to erase a village and were instead erased from every road worth traveling. And as dawn broke, Josephine turned to the girl. "Your name's Amara?" The girl nodded, tears breaking. Josephine knelt. "Then welcome home. Thank you for staying with us through this journey." If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.